Alpha Team is flying around the forest zone situated in northwest Raccoon City, where we're searching for the helicopter of our compatriots Bravo Team, who disappeared during the middle of our mission.
You haven't found it?
No, I haven't found it yet. Bizarre murder cases have recently occurred in Raccoon City. There are outlandish reports of families being attacked by a group of about 10 people. Victims were apparently eaten. Bravo Team went to the hideout of the group and disappeared.
Look, Chris!
It was Bravo Team's helicopter. Nobody was in it. But strangely, most of the equipment was still there. However, we soon discovered why.
Hey! Come here! No! Don't go! Jill, run for that house!
There are only 3 STARS members left now.
Resident Evil.
Hey, I'm Will.
And I'm Chris.
We're the Rat Boys.
Today we'll be reviewing and comparing the original Resident Evil and its remake.
Which one is better? Are they even good? Stay tuned to find out.
To preface this, both of us have experience with these games.
We've done multiple runs of this game on stream and in our childhoods.
Before we begin, let's review the scoring process.
We take 11 properties that every game should share and rank them from 1 to 10 individually.
We then take those scores and average them together to get our personal score.
Then we take our personal scores and average them together to get our final score.
Got it? Good. Let's begin.
The original Resident Evil was released March of '96 for the PS1 and pioneered the survival horror genre. The game is currently available through emulator, online archive sites, and maybe even on the PSN.
Meanwhile, the remake was originally released on GameCube in March of 2002, and is still easily available on Steam for $20, along with Xbox One, Switch, and on the PlayStation Network.
Both games were developed and published by Capcom, the creators of Mega Man, Street Fighter, Monster Hunter, and many more.
Both games can casually be played through in 5 to 7 hours, with the remake being notably larger.
In 1998, a Special Forces team is sent to investigate some bizarre murders on the outskirts of Raccoon City. Upon arriving, they are attacked by a pack of bloodthirsty dogs and are forced to take cover in a nearby mansion. But the scent of death hangs heavy in the air. Supplies are scarce as they struggle to stay alive. I would say that's probably one of the most vaguest descriptions of a game that I've seen in a while. In reality, this game follows right after the events of Resident Evil 0. Check out our video on that later. You control STARS members Jill or Chris to explore and solve the mysteries of this mansion that no one could really reasonably live in, all while fighting the horrors within.
There's many differences between the original and the remake, but the story ultimately remains the same.
The original popularized tank controls, limited space inventory, and fixed camera angles.
The remake recaptures all of these attributes, but keeps them all within the same theme. Whether or not it's better, we'll get into that later.
In addition to those changes, the remake also adds new things like enemies, puzzles, entire new sections, and defense weapons.
In both versions, the gameplay remains similar. Fight zombies, don't get hit, fight camera angles, and manage your equipment to get through the next puzzle.
The original has really good fixed camera angles, comparably to other fixed camera angle games. Fighting in this version only occasionally puts you into awkward angles of not being able to see what you are fighting.
The map layout is really well done. Being able to zigzag through the mansion when you know where you're going is really nice, especially with how you can reach most places pretty easily once you've opened up the mansion and unlocked most or all of the doors. The enemies that get introduced around the time you have such free reign do kinda suck, but ultimately can be maneuvered around if you're good at reading their AI. Honestly, it's back to the map layout again. It's much better with the shortcuts from the backyard to the east wing of the mansion, even the hallways throughout the game that link you back up to other hallways back to the beginning, where you're going to the main hall. Even stuff with the second floor going back to the first floor, etc. It's all great, to be honest.
Classic maps are classic for a reason. The layout in both versions feel very well thought out. It can be confusing to newcomers, which is kind of the point in my opinion, but after a bit you could easily map out the mansion from memory. Even with the new area additions in the remake, my opinion on this remains the same.
In the remaster, the controls are better for dodging, unsurprisingly considering tank control. However, it did catch me up pretty bad on camera changes because of the camera not always going whichever direction I was pressing to go. Last thing I think was really good would have been the puzzles. They were revamped and updated. Some of it was kind of the same, but most of the beginning and mid puzzles were just much better. Like fixing pieces inside of a box to match properly. It was a bit jank, sure, but it was still more innovative than push the statue on top of the vent button to progress.
The flow of progression between item upgrades, heals, and ammo feels good in both versions. The only noticeable issue is the potential to use too much in the early game, but that's kind of the point of survival horror. You're supposed to manage your resources. The remake is very true to the original, with nothing feeling like it's taken away. All retcons and additions feeling like they belong. This is always a worry whenever it comes down to remakes, because they can go so far off the original's path in both story and gameplay.
1996 Resident Evil, weaponry in-game feels right in my opinion. Most enemies fall to the weapons as easily as you would expect them to. The bazooka deals massive damage, just like the Magnum, and the shotgun with well-timed shots can take out small clumpings of enemies, saving ammo. Just feels right. Pistol still feels kinda trash, especially in Chris's campaign. Not sure why Chris takes more shots to kill zombies on average, but it's life. What can you do? One of the biggest issues that I had whenever it came down to 96's Resident Evil was consistently losing out on ammo when pulling the trigger at virtually the same time as being hit. I'm not sure if this was a normal glitch, but I lost quite a bit of Magnum ammo that didn't deal damage to the in-game boss. And I also lost quite a few shotgun shells to hunters and zombies because I didn't gauge the distance as well as I should have. For me, it was a pretty huge negative considering the round shot off without audio-visual confirmation, and I didn't damage the enemy I was shooting at. So I was just constantly bleeding ammo. So one thing that I really did consider like an actual bad thing for 1996 Resident Evil was the lack of being able to switch out ammo on the bazooka, as the game calls the grenade launcher. Meaning you have to use the ammo on an enemy that isn't always suited for that type of damage. This is quite frustrating whenever it comes down to it because you're not able to get the ammo that you want to use out onto the enemy that you want to use it on. So you have to plan accordingly. However, this was fixed in the remake. Another thing that I found bad was Chris's lack of weaponry. He only gets the shotgun and handgun for most of the game. Then there's a one-off weapon and the Magnum, but that's endgame weaponry. Jill has 3 weapons throughout most of her playthrough, and personally it would have been nice to have the bazooka as well. I think it would have helped immensely, but I guess that Chris is more of a challenge run than an easy run. Whenever it comes down to the remaster, there's not really that much bad in the game. Nothing really stands out for me. But there are some bad camera angles here and there that really can mess you up. But generally, they are pretty far and few between. However, when they are messing you up, they can really mess you up, especially against bosses, the tight corners whenever it comes down to the hallways, and even, say, with the hunters, whenever you're trying to run away from them. This was something that I found out after playing the game and watching the second playthrough, but the beginning questionnaire makes it feel like you're picking between easy, medium, and hard, but it turns out the game is picking between very easy, easy, and medium. It genuinely should have been clearer on that part in my opinion. I played through the game on easy not knowing that I was playing on easy, and that was a bit disheartening.
It's only after you beat the game that you get these options for simple difficulty selection. Why this wasn't available from the start, I don't know, but it definitely should have been. Fixed camera angles and tank controls scares off a lot of people who didn't grow up with them. I would implore those of you who are intimidated by such things to not overthink how hard it is to navigate. Does it make the game harder? It can, but over time, you'll get used to it. It may never feel completely natural, and you may take some extra hits because of it, but it's not really that bad.
I found the tank controls to be quite mid whenever it came down to it. They weren't bad, but they weren't really all that great either. They did have a saving grace whenever it came down to it, which is that it didn't take you and turn you around whenever the camera switched angles. For the remaster, whenever it comes down to stuff that's mid, box management was one thing that I would bring up. There's quite a lot of items in this game that you have to sort through. Sure, you can take the time to put them in proper places, but most of the time you aren't going to want to do that. The box could have been organized better probably. Not sure if the system back then would have allowed it. I don't have any games off the top of my head that had better inventory management at that time.
Puzzles. They're everywhere. None of them are super high in difficulty, but there's tons of them. This is just the mainstay of the series. This shouldn't dissuade you from the series. Even if you don't like puzzles, I'd still say that they're not just going to ruin your experience here.
Speaking of puzzles, most were just about moving boxes, stone statues, etc. to cover some hole to not get hit by poison gas, or maybe a tentacle that could come out of the ground. It was overall pretty meh. They did have some creative puzzles, but there weren't many. I'm not sure that I can blame them because of the hardware they were working with back then. I'm not sure how many games had decent puzzles back in 1996.
The original voiceovers and live action sections are loved by most, but the remake changes all of that. There's not really any jokes, on purpose anyways, and is overall a more serious tone. Whether that's for better or worse, it's debatable, but it's a noticeable change between the versions.
For me, the music was pretty mid for the most part as well. Some music just didn't queue up at the right times. Like with completing the puzzle for the paintings, plays something that almost feels oddly ominous and just feels so out of place.
This always bothers me a bit, but in the remake, all cutscenes will only show the normal costume regardless of what you are actually wearing. If it was pre-rendered cutscenes, I'd understand a bit better, but these are all mostly in-game rendered cutscenes, so it doesn't make any sense to me why it just doesn't give you what you're wearing on screen. This personally dissuades me from using the alternative skins. It's got no bearing on the actual game itself, but it gets to me every time a game does this. In both versions, the hunters can be pretty all over the place in terms of movements and actions, sometimes swiping mid-air, stun-locking you, and jumping for no other reason. In the remake, zombies lunge at you, but it's almost seemingly at random. Hitboxes for dogs getting you is pretty wild at times, and a couple of boss hitboxes on you seemed way off, but only sometimes. It's not the worst thing really, but it's something to keep in mind whenever you go through this. The original graphics are tolerable. The character models don't hold up nearly as well as the backgrounds do though. But some of the cutscenes are entertaining due to their low quality. On top of that, there's quite a bit of visual glitches, like enemies popping in and out of frame, but nothing too major. The camera angles, like I said before, are still really good. When fighting, you have a lower chance of the camera going crazy. So for a 27-year-old game, it's not bad. But ultimately the graphics themselves don't hold up. 3 rats. The remake, on the other hand, looks great. The dark tones, shadows, and certain perspective elements really do a lot for me here. Enemy shadows casting on the walls so you can tell where they are, even if you can't directly see them. Rooms with mirrors to see around corners. These things are pretty great, not seen very often anymore anywhere. The drawback is the additional camera angles. Navigating can be pretty annoying. Unlike in the original, you may run into a situation where you're running around changing between 2 or 3 camera angles very quickly trying to fight something, but it's not that bad. There's a bit of sharp edges in the graphics department as well, but that's just nitpicking. Overall, I would give it an 8 out of 10 rats.
Resident Evil 1996 visually wasn't all that impressive. Overall, unappealing when it came to the graphics and some cutscenes. They did have good cutscenes to an extent though, but it wasn't amazing or anything. I'd say overall, the visual aspect of this game was about a 5 in my opinion. The remaster was visually better in just about every aspect. They did reuse some things whenever it came down to the update, specifically the first video of a zombie gnawing on your friend. Something about it just didn't look right for me. Maybe it was the background just being black instead of having the room in the background, but it just didn't really sit well with me. You can definitely tell it's the same video, but to get back on topic, give the visuals an overall 7 for the time. It's really good graphically.
Sounds and music of the original are pretty iconic. There's some pretty good tracks, and the zombie sounds are still fun to hear. Some tracks seem to be out of place though, and we were having some minor audio pops from time to time, but that could just be our setup. 6 rats for the OG. The remake seems to have completely different music that is a bit more subtle, but is also more fitting for today's themes. The sounds in general are just a bit better in quality overall, so for the remake I'll give it an 8.
The audio for the 1996 Resident Evil was just mid in my opinion. They had some issues whenever it came down to the music, and the safe room music wasn't my preferred. The shots did sound good for the most part though. As for the overall audio rating, I'd give it a 5 rats as well. The audio in the remake was updated. The overall music score and sound of basically everything was just better, no question. The save room music was more up to snuff. The original game just didn't have good save room music in my opinion. With all that being said, giving the audio a 6, it was actually good.
Whether it's the original or the remake, the story is pretty mid. They do the job and nothing more. Cutscenes are sporadic and generally unimportant. You'll get most of what you need to know from notes. Even its quote-unquote best scenes are pretty uninformative overall. The remaster is a bit better, but it's still pretty unimpressive. The original game gets a 4, and the remake gets a 5. I think that if the supporting characters were used more effectively, the score here would increase substantially. But whatever.
The individual stories was a nice idea. However, Chris's story was super lackluster comparative to Jill's. Jill knew how to do basically everything that the game requested of her, while Chris was just the brawny musclehead with a lack of a brain and generally corny one-liners.
Oh, I can't believe it! Are you okay?
Yeah, so much for him. We got to the root of the problem.
As opposed to his later in the series personality. I give the overall story 5.5 rats. Jill's story was a 7 in my opinion, while Chris's was a 4. I think that the story in this overall game was a 6. This is based on all of what I could read lore-wise, and how it was overall handled better with Chris's story. Jill still had a fairly solid story. I'm not a fan of them taking out some more key moments to build tension with a certain character, but it's whatever. As for Chris, he has a bit of dialogue towards the end of the game that doesn't quite add up to how he should react whenever he meets up with a friend, but I guess to an extent it does actually make sense. However, the same dialogue doesn't actually carry over whenever you meet up with the in-game boss and the other character that you're supposed to meet in that final area. I will settle with the score of the story being a 6.
Pacing is well done in both games. Weapons, heals, ammo, there's no real issues there. Shortcuts are generally pretty good, and the environmental changes are acceptable. The only issue is that there's a bit of walking back and forth, but with proper planning, it won't be too excessive. Both games in this category get an 8 from me.
There's some things that just didn't feel well thought out. Pacing just wasn't very well put together, but then you get through some sections that were very well put together in the beginning. I'd have to say that the latter half of the game is probably where most of the pacing issues rise, so I would have to give the game a 4 on whenever it comes down to pacing. Pacing in this game is mostly the same, but you do have the introduction of some interesting plot points. They didn't change the ending as well, which felt better. I'd say the overall pacing for the remake was just average, really. It was good in the mansion, falls off in the underground section like previously, and the lab goes by really fast. I'd say that it's about a 5.5 whenever it comes down to the pacing.
Your minute-to-minute gameplay is solid for both versions, but for different reasons. In the original, it's the simplicity of the enemies, and damage seeming to be a solid number instead of a ratio number. If you blast a zombie in the face with the shotgun, the head will always get blown off. That changes in the remake. The challenge comes from managing space and resources to progress. In the remake, it's overall more challenging. New moves for enemies, the addition of new enemies, new tools to handle those enemies, but more challenging doesn't always mean better. As far as gameplay goes, they both get an 8 from me.
For the 1996 Resident Evil, the gameplay wasn't too grand in my opinion. It was your average tank control classic Resident Evil, but it didn't really stand out and feel as good as the later franchise games, like how something like Resident Evil 3 did, or Outbreak, or others. But that comes with being first. It's a work in progress to make the game what it is today. Overall though, I'd give it a 4. Kinda bad, not awful, or just not good. The filling in Resident Evil Remake, whenever it comes down to gameplay, filling in this game with freedom of movement was so much better than the original. Not to say that they fixed everything, but it just helped out. So dodging zombies' lunges was easier. Even dodging hunters and bosses just felt better. I'd say the overall score for the gameplay is a 6 for me.
The original simplicity for its mechanics does bring the score down here a bit for me. Puzzles are ultra simple. Inventory management is more of a chore. Giving Jill lockpicks and giving Chris nothing. Like, at least the remake gave him a lighter. And I get that Chris was hard mode for the original and still is for the remake comparatively. But Jill literally got everything. 5 out of 10 rats for the original. The remake adds Crimson Heads, which requires extra thought and future planning to effectively deal with, leveling the playing field a little bit with Chris, and generally smoothing everything out from the original. 8 rats.
Camera angles in this game were honestly really good, and the running with tank controls really was more of a boon for those camera angles. Sure, dodging was a bit harder, but it was still positive. As for resource management, it was mostly the same, and the puzzles, they weren't amazing at all really, so I'd say that the game was more on the average side, so a 5 to be honest. Camera angles messing up pathing when you use the analog stick, the resource management being an actual challenge was good, puzzles also being easily picked up and finished or more intuitive to do overall. I'd say mechanically the game is good. It's definitely not got a ton of negatives. The one glaring negative was with the camera messing myself and Will up and really hinder this score, but I'm still giving the remaster a 6.
As the same with story, both games lack actual character development overall, and would have benefited from the supporting cast being a little bit more relevant throughout the game. No one really changed or anything, but it did enough to get the point across. 4 rats for the OG, and 5 rats to the remake.
Chris staying kinda dumb throughout the game, and just not really being capable of doing anything story related by himself was pretty bad in my opinion. I guess I get it if they were trying to make his story a definitive hard mode. I just don't like how dumb he is portrayed to be. As for Jill, she still doesn't really have any real character development either. Jill stays Jill throughout the game. You just get introduced to how she is, and that's her. However, Barry, whenever it comes down to it, he seemed to have all the character development in the game, actually. So that's something. I'll give the game a 4 on the overall character development. Chris still being Chris, just like in the original game. Jill still mostly being Jill. Again, the only real character development was Barry, fortunately. Or fortunately, really depends on how you look at it. I guess maybe you could also argue Wesker, because he changes through the game on Chris's campaign. But yeah, it's still going to be a 4 for me, honestly.
So for me, whenever it comes to world development for these games, it's about the flow of the map throughout the entire game, which is good. The introduction and usage of enemy types, which was also good. Like, you can really notice the power difference between a zombie and a hunter. I'm also looking at lore for the series and within the game itself. When it comes to the OG in that regard, it gave us what we know today. But I also think they didn't plan to be making multiple Resident Evil games at the time. The remake added and cleaned up these aspects. So for the original, I give it a 6, and for the remake, I give it a 7.
The mansion is really good as you get the keys and open up more sections and areas. There's nothing too amazing about the cave system, like it does have unique interactions with the boulders. Then the lab is honestly kind of the same throughout. There's no shortcuts unlocked as you go through. I'd say that the overall world development was 5. The mansion is great in this game. The amount of options you have to navigate the mansion really swells up as the game goes on. And honestly, you need these options to deal with the later threats. The cave was changed a bit, not enough to be significant in my opinion, and the lab, it's mostly the same as well. I'd say, however, the mansion really carried this game's world development. I'll give this a 6 for that mostly because of the mansion and even the minor changes with cave and lab.
Both games are still really fun to me, but it's also a genre that I enjoy anyways. Having to worry about resources, what enemies to kill or to avoid, trying to fit everything into my 6-slot pocket, and then getting put up against giant bosses. It's just a good time for me personally, even if it is rat-proof sometimes. There's some minor annoyances, sure, but it doesn't stop me from giving both of these games an 8 rats.
Honestly, it wasn't that fun. It had some challenging moments. It has a kind of rough start, as most Resident Evils do. Then you start gaining your items, and then you're set by the end of the game. Really, it was alright overall. So I'd give it a fat 5 rats. The updates with the controls, the introduction of many enemies, the story plot having updates to certain dialogue, and changes to scenes to make them play more smoothly. Ultimately, I'd say it was better than the original. The extra challenge made the game better in my opinion. I'd say that overall, the game was more of a 5.5 to a 6 on the fun scale, but I'll go on ahead and stick with 5.5.
The replay value for the original game and remake is partially due to their short playtime, along with it having 2 basic campaigns to pick from. There's also some unlockables, like costumes and weapons, in the remake and the original, and in the remake there's also 2.5 additional modes depending on how you look at it to unlock and play through. Real survival, which is very hard mode, where your storage system doesn't connect and auto aim is turned off, with it also being set on hard mode. There's also invisible enemy mode, and the half I'm talking about I'm not going to spoil. So for the original game, I give it a 6, and for the remake, I give it an 8.
Was it replayable? Kind of. I'll give it a 5.5 on replayability. I'd probably mostly get just 3 to 4 real replays out of this game before it's just not interesting anymore. There's not really much to replay for. You could play to see Kenneth being half-eaten, try and get a 3-hour speed run of the game, timed down for unlimited rocket launcher. And you would also have your 2 playthroughs for Chris and Jill, so maybe you would have roughly 3 plays until rocket launcher, and 1 more to use it a bit, or even beat the game with it. But after that, what do? Challenge yourself? I don't know. But yeah, I'll go ahead and stick with a 5.5 on the score. This game has quite a bit more replayability than its predecessor. You have the 2 mode unlocks, real survival and invisible enemies. You have your other 2 unlocks, Samurai Edge and the anti-tank launcher, which is beating the game in under 5 hours and 3 hours, respectively. So I'd give the game a 6 with replayability. There's not a lot of content added, not stuff I would want to replay for anyway.
I felt the same after both games. I would, will, and have completed multiple challenge runs for the remake, but the original simplicity brings its own charm to the table. I just think everything here is just very digestible. Like after going through both campaigns on either version, you'll then have a full grasp on what needs to be done for future playthroughs. And it's fun enough to continuously come back to. 8 for both.
Coming off of my playthrough with Chris Redfield, and after watching Jill's playthrough the night before, I gotta say, it was pretty disappointing with Chris's playthrough. Though the ending for Wesker was much more interesting, Chris's ending, I can't say that it left me in a state of awe or euphoria. I was just disappointing. Spare you the rant that would cover probably another 20 to 30 seconds, but I'd have to give my final feelings a 4.5. I just wish there was a bit more to the ending, and honestly the dialogue for certain things could have been taken more seriously. It's a 6.5 for the final fillings on the remaster. Jill's story was solid, Chris's story was more well put together. The puzzles felt right, mechanics weren't terrible, and gameplay was good, so it just felt overall better than the original.
So my personal score for the 96 version is a solid 6 out of 10 rats. It's still really good, fun, enjoyable experience. To be expected, it kinda looks like garbage, but the solid gameplay more than makes up for it in my opinion. Over on the remake side, my score is a 7.4. It's hard to think of bad things about this game, but what definitely holds it back is the story. Even though they worked on it, I still think it's pretty weak. But besides that, it's an amazing game, for a rat like me.
The average score for Resident Evil 96 was a 4.8. The game just didn't feel that great for me, and the story was very lackluster. The characters don't have much for development, and the game wasn't super fun, and maybe I'm a bit harsh on this game, which I'll take full blame if someone feels that way, but it just wasn't that good comparatively to the remake. My overall average score for the remake, I've got a 5.9 as the end score for the game. Personally, I can agree with this score. I mostly rated the game within a barrage of 6s, 7, and 4 mixed. The game was in general good. A decent gameplay setting, the resource management wasn't horrible, and the mapping was pretty damn excellent. Oh yeah, I'd say it deserves a 5 point.
When it comes to the original 1996 Resident Evil, our combined scores come out to a 5.4. Even though my score is higher, I could see people new to the genre or the younger players be put off by the graphics and data design flaws. But at the very least, if you give the original a play, you're not going to hate it. If anything, the acting will be enough to get you through.
So with our totals combined, we become the number 6.7. A lame joke. Get in my domicile and fight me about it. It's a good game. It has a great atmosphere visually. The mansion was really well set map-wise. The story was overall really good. Just a solid game through and through, especially compared to the original game, and even compared to Resident Evil 0. A hot take, maybe, but it's our opinion.
Before we continue, let's do a quick review of the truly definitive version of how to play Resident Evil, with Resident Evil Deadly Silence for the Nintendo DS. This game is another version of the Resident Evil 1 with new puzzles and some other minor changes from the original to suit the touchscreen, but also featuring rebirth mode that adds even more puzzles, more enemy spawns, and a CPR section for saving Richard where you blow into the microphone like a pissed off 12-year-old playing Fortnite.
Don't pick me up!
This was also the first game to add multiplayer, where 4 players get points for killing monsters in the mansion, kind of like a horde mode. You can go find the hardware for this game, or just go train an emu, but good luck trying to have anyone play with you. This version of the game ranks somewhere in the 5s. So now between those 3 games, the best one to experience, definitively, as judged by us, is the remake, obviously. This is what a proper remake should look like. It only added to the story and lore, while keeping the same style and theme of the original. First off, and probably the most popular, Resident Evil HD Remaster Randomizer by Ben Powell on ben-gaming.co.uk. I've used this mod quite a bit. This allows you to randomize enemies, items, and even doors. It's very well done, and I've never really had any issues with it in the past. Next we have 1996 Inventory and Menu Sounds by Rika's316. This mod does what you think. Adds a lot of menu sounds from the original game to the remaster. Third, we have Resident Evil HD Remaster Ultimate Trainer by Razor. This mod gives you a lot of control options, but for me, I think the most useful option is to skip the door loading screens. There's a lot of options here to give you almost complete control over your game. Resident Evil HD Remaster Enemy Multiplier by Alex Kander. This mod unleashes the hordes by increasing spawn rates by 5, 7, or 10 times the amount normally there. So, good luck with that. And finally, I'm not going to go through them all. There's a lot, and I mean a lot, of costume packs for the remake that brings all the costumes from all the different versions, from the PC version to the Sega Saturn version, which the only real changes were cosmetics. So go to Nexus, find which costumes you actually like. They have pretty much everything.
That about wraps things up for this one. Hopefully this has benefited you in some way, shape, or form. If you happen to be feeling generous, give us a subscription on our channel. If you want to hang out every once in a while, follow us on Twitch under our Twitch name, RatKing0. If you want to watch some of our older content, check out our other channel here on YouTube under the name Boi Archive. Till next time, Rat Boys out.
There he goes. Crash, you having fun yet?
No. Your laugh is so much like my sister's. I really want to headbutt you. I really want to headbutt you so bad. He laughs exactly like my sister.
Riding away. And then he becomes a thug. Oh, he's a fast thug.
Fantastic.
Hey, Crash. Come over here and look at what we got.
You hit me with a dildo, what the fuck?